Every day it's getting closer, going faster than a roller coaster. Love like yours will surely come my way. Hey, hey, hey.
Well, welcome everybody to the Shute Farmstead. And I'm Dirk Knutson. I'm the president of the Hillsboro Historical Society. So thanks so much for coming, especially in the heat. Is everybody doing okay? Can I get a amen? All right. I'm supposed to, can I get an amen? All right. If everybody's good, we got ice cream bars for after. All right? And please feel free to get up and go get cold drinks and snacks. There's all kind of stuff over there. So it wasn't meant to be a big lunch today or a barbecue. We'd probably do that next year, but we've been off for a couple of years. This is my third year as president of our Hillsboro Historical Society. And our organization is 22 years old this year. And so welcome to the Shute House. I want to introduce our hosts. Let's see, is Lisa here? Where's Lisa? Did she just walk off? Okay, well, we're here being hosted by Lisa Haig Goldbeck and her husband Randy, and they have our little farm and garden, our little farm and nursery out in Helvetia, and they're staples at Saturday Market. Great people. And they, with her brother, Mark Haig, the oldest of the Haigs that was raised here, just recently bought the property out of the estate to try to make something out of it. So you can see a lot of work going on here. The house is by no means ready, and I'll talk about the house in a minute. But Lisa has the red barn open, has everything from her homemade pepper jellies to amazing plants for your garden, to art, to soap. There's stuff going on down there. It's fun. So we thank them for letting us use their beautiful work in progress. So I wanted to also introduce who's here with the Historical Society. I have with us Matt Anderson. He's our current treasurer. And Matt is a pretty long-time Hillsboro guy. And if you ever have building history questions, and this guy's the man. And he's going to unleash his personal website soon enough with just incredible history on most of our really cool buildings in Greater Hillsboro. Next to him is Judy Gates Goldman. You'll hear about Judy in a little bit. Judy's one of the Meek family. She is Colonel Joe and Virginia Meek's great-granddaughter. And we'll talk about them in a minute. And then Liza Shute has been with our board on and off, and former curator of the Washington County Museum, now the Five Oaks Museum. And Liza, you're now at Clark County, one of the best working historical minds in the Pacific Northwest. All these guys are. Next to her is Jaden Donnell. He is a offspring of Swede Ralston. If you know the Ralstons or have heard of the Ralston family from Swede, was kind of a co-founder of what the Hillsboro Airport has become, and a giant in the airplane industry. Who else do we have with us from our group, guys? Anybody else? Okay, our membership's about 15 to 25 at any given time. We'd like to grow that to about 50. It's only $25 a year. And now that we're out of COVID, we're going to be doing a lot of fun stuff. So I want to just quickly recap it here at our annual meeting, some of the things we've done the last few years. And this is not just as a board. A lot of our members have taken their own private action, but we consider them acting on behalf of our mission, which is to protect, preserve, and to educate all things related to historical events, people, places in and around Greater Hillsboro. And it's a very important job right now, as you can probably see. So we have personally been involved in the creation of the Urinco Woods Nature Park. If you've been there, probably one of the great assets Hillsboro has now. Was slated for housing. We were able to work through the legal means to get it to a park, and that was quite an effort, quite an outcome. Every year, the ladies and others are involved in monumental moments at the Hillsboro Pioneer Cemetery. And we also do things like graveyard restoration. We had 3 different people call us the last year or so saying, we found gravestones on our property. Can you help? And that's the kind of stuff we get involved in. In 2 cases, those beautiful old 1880 stones went back to where they needed to go. Sometimes people took them, quote unquote. Sometimes they were extras. There's hardly anybody that's been lost that cannot be found and put back where they belong. And that's kind of nice when we can do that. And Judy herself has worked on a lot of the pioneer cemeteries in Washington County. We do educational panels. We recently spoke to a city leadership group and helped them understand where they're at. Because a lot of us haven't been here very long. Who's been here longer than 40 years? Okay, pretty good. How about 30 years? 20? Quite a few. How about, who's been here 10 years? 10? And who's younger than 10? You guys? You guys are from Hillsboro, right? All you kids, good to see you here. Anyway, we all have a different version of Hillsboro. We're also working on restoration at the old Copperstone right now. I'm doing that personally, but our board did a cool beam signing time capsule event there. We'll probably do that again before that big beam goes back into the attic for 100 years. The Ralph Harvey building next to Wilson Sports Pub is being rehabbed, and we're supporting them into an 1880s authentic brick pub, cool building that'll really wow people when they see it. The Orinco Mercantile was recently sold, and we're supporting them in their application to the National Historic Registry. The Atfalati Ridge Grade School in North Plains, the new grade school, members of our team were instrumental in naming that school as such for our native people. We have a new little pop-up museum at my office at 222 East Main Street. And then we're currently funding the digitization of the Hillsboro Argus from 1922 through 1949. That's costing $15,000. Our group has raised $5,000. And we'll be doing some active fundraising to find sponsors to help get the rest of that on. I want to thank Walt Hellman here, Dusty Walt, that was singing for you guys, for bringing that project to the forefront. Because how many people, when they have questions, the Argus was Washington County. It was Hillsboro, and people that knew the Argus before it was taken out of circulation by the ownership of the Oregonian. It really holds the memories of our very wonderful community, and they covered everything from Sherwood out to the coast, but it was a very Hillsboro focus. As those go online, people will be able to go on there and read them and research names and words and events. And so we're hopeful to have it through 1949, and then we'll lobby for that family to give us the rest of the issues. Right now, they don't want to give us access after 49, but we're working on it. That's a big project, so thank you, Walt, for bringing that forward. The Methodist Meeting House Memorial across the street is clearly an effort of our members as well as the Haig family here. We'll talk about that. And then the Shute Farmstead that we're on. And there's Lisa. Can you stand up? Say hi, Lisa. This is Lisa Haig Goldbeck. She's our host with her family. We talked about you when you weren't here. And they have taken on this job, as I've said. Now, her sister-in-law, Erin Haig, was able to get this wonderful property on the National Historic Registry. That's a big effort. It's a big commitment, because when you put something on a National Historic Registry, it's much harder to alter it and to do something with it. So I'm just going to make a plea to all of you here today that we need members, and being a member at $25, all that does is support us in some of the work we do. And it's amazing what having just a few good people working on things can do. I mean, in most cases, it only takes 3 to 5 people of a similar mind to make something happen. And we've been able to do that. And it needs to happen right now, because as you drive around out here, you see what's happening, right? You see what's going on around us. And we'll talk about that too. But this is probably one of the most crucial times in our history as members of this community that we do preserve our history. It's not just here. all over the valley, things are being displaced, removed, dug up, torn out, and things like this beautiful oak tree are being cut out without a whole lot of forethought. And really, we're in a political environment, everyone, where we can change things, but it's difficult because the almighty dollar is kind of ruling the day. And Amazon's about ready to open next door with 1,000 delivery vans and 40 acres of asphalt. And there's not a lot we could do to stop that kind of thing. We're trying to mitigate and educate and do things like green belts and memorials and things like that. It takes people writing letters, calling, talking to their city. This is difficult if you've been here very long to see what's happening, and it's been difficult on me personally. And I tip my hat to anybody that's trying to make a difference, whether that's in your backyard, whether it's helping a neighbor make a decision not to remove an older house and maybe rehab or find a buyer that will. If we're always available to you guys. We have a pretty vast group in terms of what can be done, because a lot of times people feel like nothing can happen, I can't make a difference. And I can tell you for a fact, there are ways to slow things down. There are ways to get things like greenbelt trails. And from here to the Meek Place, a mile that way, all the way to North Plains, I mean, so let's transition real quick, because we are in not a historic place. We are in one of the most historic places, not only in Hillsboro, not only in Oregon, but in the whole Pacific Northwest. And a lot of it had to do with the people that were here before. And you guys want to listen to this. So I want you to kind of go back with me here. I'm going to take you on a little time travel, okay? It's going to take about 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll go to our keynote. So you guys, Sebastian, take a look behind you there, buddy. What do you see? And you think that's a pretty old tree? Okay. Do you think that tree's older than me? How much older do you think it is? Pretty close. Well, I'm 60, so that would mean it was 160 years, okay? That's pretty good, buddy. We're thinking this tree is about 200 years. We've done some aging on it. If that tree is 200 years ago, that means children that were what we call the First Nation children, the first people that ever lived here, the native children, would have been playing under that tree. And you could go touch that tree just like they did. And they're gone now. There's some still here, but that tree is older than anybody that ever lived here, except for the native people. So we go back 15,000 years, you guys, right where we're at. And this valley had woolly mammoths and ground sloths. You know what a ground sloth is? That's a 10-foot tall sloth creature that can reach up and pull things off the tree and eat it. We had some varieties of horse and mastodons. You guys know what a mastodon is? Giant elephant with giant tusks, kind of an elephant. So sometime around 15 years ago, Lake Missoula up in Montana decided it was time for it to unleash its 2,000 feet deep lake that was bigger than all of the Great Lakes put together. And when those ice dams began to break and that water began to run over hundreds and hundreds of years, the Columbia River was formed, the valley was formed, the Willamette Valley was formed. It came through the Clearwater River country, through eastern Washington, through the Palouse and the Gorge. Enough water that if it was to happen today, it's 1,000 times more water than the Columbia River has, all at one time. Then Lake Allison was formed by a confinement of the land around Kalama, Washington, and then the water backed up all the way to Eugene, 400 feet deep. The Oregon City Gap gave way to the water running through the Willamette Valley, and then at Lake Oswego, the Lake Oswego Gap opened up. And I don't know if you know this when you guys look around here in Washington County, we're in a big bowl here, aren't we? I mean, we really are. We're in a big horseshoe-shaped bowl. And when that gap opened at Lake Oswego, and what we like to call Sucker Lake, which is what that lake used to be known as, long before it was called Sucker Lake, the water came pouring into our valley here. So if you look up to the top of the tree, and you go up another 375 feet deep, we're at the bottom of a lake bed, 15,000 years ago. And so when we were kids, they used to say, this is the best damn farmland in the world. And I used to think they just always said that, right? I think that's something old people said. All the farmers I work for picking strawberries. Little did I know, they were right. Because over the hundreds of years that 400 feet of water that receded, I mean, you would have had lakefront property up at Pumpkin Ridge or up at Bald Peak, right? So as the water receded, it cut channels and it settled and settled and settled until we had 15 feet deep of sandy loam soil from the Palouse of eastern Washington and the glacial creeks and rivers and valleys of Montana, and all that fine sediment ended up here. 15,000 years ago. So I'm going to bring you forward from then. Let's go to about 2022 years ago. There was a man in the Middle East named Yeshua ben Yusuf. Some of us call him Jesus. He was being crucified at about that time. And at that time, here in the valley, at that same time, the Atfalati people, which is where the word Tawalati, Atfalati, Tawalatin, the Atfalati people who are were considered a band of the Kalapuya, were living peacefully, making their seasonal rounds, and had one of the most successful runs of civilization that anybody had. I mean, they had salmon, they had wapato and camas and deer and wild duck and beaver and everything they wanted, and moved amongst their 16 villages. And this went on. Some people now believe they were here when the floods were occurring. We don't know because there's not a recorded record. Our featured speaker may know. But these people did one thing very interesting that created this area. They would start a fire annually, or fires, and they would burn the valley. And they did that so that the valley would, number one, stay open and be grazing land for things like deer, so they could harvest the deer. It also provided an environment for camas to grow, which is a beautiful flower that still grows in some areas near here, and that was a bulb that they survived off of. The creeks below and the ponds were full of wapato or arrowroot, which is a very nice potato-type product, plant that they were able to survive off of. And then they also had tarweed. So tarweeds, we don't have it anymore, but it's a beautiful yellow flower, grows to about 5 feet, and would grow in vast meadows. And as they burned it, the seeds would pop loose and come off, and they would then collect that, and it was another part of their very important rounds that they were making. This oak tree is a white oak, and when you burn a valley, a white oak tree will not give up to the fire. It basically sits there and lets the fire try to burn it. Fire can't burn it. Everything else gets burned. The brush is gone. And so we had these vast open plains, and that's why this area is known as the Tualatin Plains. And we are in the East Tualatin Plains. There was the North Tualatin Plains. Why they call that North Plains? There was the West Tualatin Plains out to Gaston, and the South Tualatin Plains towards Shoals in our valley here. So that was the Atfalati. In the 1700s was a great time of change, because as a few traders, Russian fur trappers, and a few others, excuse me, my speakers came on in my classes. Unfortunately, there was a smallpox outbreak in the 1700s, and it took the Atfalati people from 15,000 here in the valley down to just hundreds, not thousands. The first time they were exposed to smallpox. 1805 and 1806, two great explorers by the name of Lewis and Clark went by the river on the other side of the hill here, and there was some light exploration done to the top of the ridge here They were busy going down to Astoria and establishing themselves, but they came by in 1805, back in 1806. So thinking about the time and place of this place. 1824, Dr. McLaughlin was hired by the Hudson's Bay Company, and he was coming from Hawaii back and forth to Fort Vancouver doing trading, 1824. One of his employees, James Logie, had a dairy farm that he ran on Sobeys Island, and Logie Trail Road, which many believe was a prehistoric trail, was named for James Logie. He married a woman, James Logie's from the Orkney Islands. He went back to the Orkney Islands. He married a 16-year-old girl named Isabel Miller and brought her to Wapatu Island, where they had a farm and a farm, and he left a couple of times, but came back and then spent the rest of his life there in 1824 to 1840. In 1840, Joe and Virginia Meek came to this valley with 3 other trappers who were trappers with Joe Meek, and they settled about a mile from here after Dr. McLaughlin, who was at Fort Vancouver, told them there's no farmland here. They wanted to be farmers, and he had been told there was meadows out here and plains where they could become farmers. And so they did that. In 1843, we got some new neighbors here. Edward and Brazilla Constable moved in. And this is their land claim that we're on. And they built a beautiful home there and raised 10 children, not far from here, just up on the corner where the highway is. That was in 1843. In 1843, Joe Meek left to a meeting at Champoeg, and with other pioneers and settlers, after some debate, a line was drawn, and he called for the question, who wanted to become British, who wanted to stay independent or be for the Union? And so in Oregon's history, our own Joe Meek and others were crucial in that decision. It was a decision that had been coming for a while, but that was a famous event that happened from here. And then in 1844, the constables allowed the Methodist missionaries to build a small church right across the street from us. So as you came in, you saw a monument there. That monument is the monument for the Methodist Meeting House, which was built in 1844. In 1847 and 1848, there was another smallpox outbreak, and the Atfalati were wiped out down to less than 75. 1851, a treaty was made with the Atfalati people that they could go out to Wapato and live happily forever at their ancestral home along Wapato Lake in Gaston. That was a treaty which would not hold. In 1854, Hiram William Meek was buried at the Methodist Meeting House site across the street. That was one of the sons of Joe and Virginia. In 1857, up here in Helvetia, a man named Charles Kawanaya, who was the son of a Hawaiian man of Hawaiian pure blood, married to a Chinook woman. Charles Kawanaya and his family settled in the hills above here and began to work and communicate with everybody here in the valley. In 1860, William H. and Josephine Meek both died, and they were the 3rd and 4th Meek children buried across the street next to the church. And we jump into 1866, and a man named John C. Shute moved from New York, started making his home out here in the Tualatin Plains, and it didn't take him very long to find a young lady living at the Constable home, and that was Lizzie Constable. As her dowry, her family gave John and Lizzie this 80 acres that we're on. And John set about the work of trying to become a farmer, and among other things, a land baron. John eventually amassed 800 acres here, and Brookwood out here was called Shute Road for a long time. John Shute went on to build quite an enterprise. The family had 3 children, Edward, Maddie, and Arthur Shute. And they built this new home in about 1888. So behind you here, most of this home, or parts of it, were built in 1888 and then remodeled. In 1900, the Meyer-Jurgen family bought this farm, and they stayed until 1959 when Raymond and Carol Haig bought it which is Lisa's mom and dad, good friends of ours, and they're both passed now in the last couple years. In 1985, well, when Raymond Hague bought this from Mr. Meyerjurgen, he was told, in those woods across the street, there are graves and there are artifacts. And that's the place of the old church. Mr. Riley on the corner told many stories of the graves and the mounds that were there. And the Hague children learned about the mounds in the spooky woods. And everyone that grew up in this area knew that that 2.5 acres of woods was to be left alone. In 1985, Ray Hague called the Hillsboro Argus and said, you need to come out here. My neighbors are going to cut the trees, and there's a graveyard there. So there was quite a controversy in 85, but yet it was logged, and not much was done. But Raymond kept lobbying very hard for the fact that there was a burial site there, and this was a very important site. And in 2014, when the state of Oregon wanted to do what was called the Grand Bargain and expand the urban growth boundary, for the first time that our boundary line's ever been moved in a private room with a semi-legislative process, a promise was made for 1 acre to stay the way it was forever by our city and by the state. That was in 2014. In 2016, the Umatilla tribe came and, working with our city, tried to find artifacts, tried to find out where is this place that's not here anymore, because over the years, the Methodist Meeting House building was removed. And much effort was made to find them, and they were not found. In the last few years, this large land purchase that you see over here happened, and some of our members, led by Judy Goldman, myself, and Ray and Carol Hague, fought very hard to make sure that everything that could be done to find those burial sites was done, and yet we were unable to find anything other than a few small artifacts. So that brings you up from 15,000 years ago to today, where we're here to celebrate the Tualatin Plains. We are fighting for preservation of things, and you will see a beautiful monument open there shortly. And I just want to thank Ray and Carol, who aren't here, but the Hague family, all of us that were involved. It was quite a fight. We got in quite a legal battle with the developer and our city, and sometimes you got to dish it out and take it on the chin and give it back to fight for what you need. And so we will hopefully have that monument there forever, and hopefully our friends, the Hagues, will be able to establish this into a heritage farm, which is what they want to do, and have events like this, and have the house open, and have people come here and celebrate on the Tualatin Plains. And even though it's being erased with large cement buildings, the heart still beats pretty strong for some here. And we have a very nice trail going in down here. And so the job for now is to help preserve this area. And we're working on similar things all over Hillsboro. So there's the time capsule. That's who we are. Thanks for wading through that. And with that, I'm going to introduce our guest speaker today, Mr. David Ellis. And David, we met through our many efforts to find these children and this lost church site across the street. He's one of the great working archaeologists in the state of Oregon. I think he's in his 40th year, roughly. And he'll, 49? 45. And he's been very gracious to come today after our first speaker canceled. And he's currently working on a number of sites here, helping developers go through state compliance. They have to hire a very small handful of archaeologists certified to do this kind of work. So I'm going to have him tell us what he's up to, a little bit about his history, and then we'll have maybe one more speaker, and we'll have a chance after that to tour the house. And I hope that you'll take the time to see the barn and get to know Lisa and what she's doing down there, okay?
I'm the exception. I don't live out here, but I've been working as an archaeologist out here in the Tualatin Valley since early 80s, I would think. I taught initially for a few years at Rock Creek, teaching archaeology classes, and then left, and then I was out at Rock Creek again teaching anthropology from 2001 to last year, finally retired from Rock Creek. And in that time, I got connected with folks at what was in the Washington County Museum, which really provided some great connections with Local folks and the archaeology of the Tualatin Valley. This is an incredibly fascinating area, and I think I have to honestly say, as a professional archaeologist, I'm probably one of the few, most professional archaeologists who've worked in Washington County, come out, do a project, and then leave. And they write a report, a nice technical report, that most people will never see. And I've tried to continue that. This is an incredibly fascinating area to work in. I've been fortunate back, one of the first big projects I did was for a proposed natural gas pipeline that ran through the Nehalem Valley, down to the valley of Mountaindale, across Bethany area, so a huge area across through the northern part of the Tualatin Valley, when that Bethany area and the Rock Creek area were all still farmland. So when I've been teaching at Rock Creek, it's interesting, I guess you could call it that, to see the change. And then more recently, been involved in the now sort of dormant project to improve, raise the dam at Hag Lake, a bunch of archaeology associated with that, and then working with the Fish and Wildlife Service out in the Gaston area for the new Wapato Lake Wildlife Refuge. So I think this is, as an archaeologist would say, it's an incredible area to work in, and at the same time, there's very few, most archaeologists are interested, working in Oregon, the professionals have been interested in the areas where there are what they think of as the really cool sites. And the challenge here, and this goes back, Dirk talked about the Missoula floods, and I don't know how many of you have heard of the Missoula floods. So one thing, a little additional detail from what Dirk was talking about, there were at least, geologists have now identified at least 80 of those floods that occurred over about a 4,000 or 5,000 year period. And Dirk was absolutely right. The greatest of those floods, where we're sitting here now, would be under 400 feet of water. So it created the valley. I do have a handout here. You can handle that. Sure. This is a map from showing the Missoula floods, and focus here on the valley. So you can see where the Tualatin Hills off to the east would have been above the water. A few places in Portland, like Rocky Butte, would have been, but pretty much most of this area, the Chehalem Ridge, would have been above the water, but pretty much we're all sitting under the bottom of a lake. And again, this would have occurred multiple times. And the newer archaeological evidence, at one point, probably like 50, 70 years ago, archaeologists would think humans have been in the New World for maybe 7,000, 8,000 years. Now it's closer to 20,000 years. There's good archaeological evidence going back 20,000 years. So there would have been people here at the time of the floods. Undoubtedly, because these floods, for the most part, happen pretty dramatically, if not traumatically. It's sort of hard to envision what you would have done. The floodwaters through the gorge would have been about 600 feet high because they're constrained within the walls of the gorge. And it's sort of like, what do you do when you wake up one morning and you look up the river and there's a 600-foot wall of water coming toward you? So where, in terms of the archaeology for the Tualatin Valley, the challenge for us as archaeologists is the valley was created during those floods, that pretty much with very minor details, the dirt you're sitting on is 12,000 years old. And therefore, I mean, there's been some changes from farming and development and so on, but for the most part, the soils that you're all through the valley, except when you get down along the rivers and the creeks, are old soils. And therefore, if you have a 12,000-year-old site, it's going to be pretty shallow. And therefore, this is where, when I was talking about other professionals tend to think of the really cool sites which are old and deeply buried. A lot of the sites that you get here in the Tualatin Valley are not deeply buried. You can get 12,000 years of artifacts within the top foot or so of the surface. So that creates a bit of a challenge with trying to figure out how old they are, because everything, 12,000 years, is all collapsed into a fairly shallow depth. And and a lot of the sites are what we call, archaeologists call like a field camp, or an area where people were out harvesting camas or tarweed or hunting. So they don't necessarily, we have yet to find anywhere in the Tualatin Valley. We know the reported village sites, the Atfalati village sites, which are concentrated particularly around Wapato Lake by Gaston. We have yet to find archaeologically find any of those villages. And we don't know whether they've been lost through development. Oregon State did some work on one up in the hills outside of Gaston back in the 70s, but they put in one unit. They dug one hole, and that's all they did, so that's all we know. So this is one of the reasons I think that many professional archaeologists have not shown that much interest in the Tualatin Valley, because those kinds of shallow sites that are sometimes very hard to date and hard to sort of reconstruct what people were doing there, archaeologists like deep, old sites where you can really easily reconstruct. And therefore, I think this is what's one of the challenges with working in archaeology in the Tualatin Valley, is you don't have a lot of information that would be ideal to have in terms of figuring out what was going on. And certainly there hasn't been as much work done around Gaston and Wapato Lake that would be ideal. We're hoping, as the Fish and Wildlife Service starts developing the Wapato Lake Wildlife Refuge, there'll be a little more work. The early General Land Office surveyors who came through in the 1850s and 1860s working around Wapato Lake have a few very scattered references to Indian settlements, but those early surveyors were not really that interested. They were out here to nail down the boundaries of land claims. And therefore, with some exceptions, they're not really keeping a good record of where they saw native settlements. And this, again, is part of the challenge we have of really reconstructing 12,000, 15,000, 18,000 years of native settlement in the Tualatin Valley. So we move on, and then we move on to, as we move on to that sort of pre-contact era into that early contact period. You know, as Dirk mentioned, there was a smallpox. You have the Atfalati who are here. They are the northernmost band of the Kalapuyan people that extended all through the Willamette Valley, all the way up to the upper end of the valley, the Cottage Grove area, and so on. And there's still some debate about how many different Kalapuyan bands there were. They had shared language, but they differed with the types of river valleys and so on that they lived in, what kinds of resources they had. Anthropologists have labeled the Willamette Valley as, in North America, one of the areas with the most diversity in terms of languages. Because each one of those bands, the Kalapuyan bands, did have a general Kalapuyan language, but they also had different dialects. So they could communicate with each other, but they had slightly different vocabulary, slightly different pronunciation, slightly different accents. And it's that incredible complexity, which, by the way, for anthropologists interested in linguistics have found this a challenge to really reconstruct that complexity and diversity that you saw in the Willamette Valley. It was unlike anywhere else in North America in a relatively small area. So when you start having European American settlement beginning in the late 1700s, they're not really settlement, but contact, the fur trade along the coast, and that's what introduces smallpox in the 1770s. And when Lewis and Clark came through in 1805, 1806, they actually saw people living along the Columbia who had smallpox scars. So they were people who probably as children had smallpox and survived it. There were more smallpox outbreaks. The big epidemic was in the early 1830s with malaria. And they've been able to pin down the exact ship in 1829 that had sailors on it who already were carrying malaria, and then that spread to native populations, and there was no immunity. For the Chinookan people who lived on the lower Columbia, it's estimated between 1830 and 1834, 96 to 98% of the population died of malaria. An incredible short period of time. And I don't know if some of you may know from your family's history, malaria was once common even among white settlers in the valley, but there was treatment for it. It was called fever and ague. The mosquito that carries malaria is native to this area. It's just that until that 1829 ship that brought it in, the mosquitoes, the Anopheles mosquitoes, there was no malaria for them to carry, and then it became common. Some of the early settlers here in the valley were coming from the Mississippi Valley, where malaria was common, and one of the reasons some of them moved out here was to flee the epidemics of malaria in the Mississippi Valley, so they sort of brought that with them. But again, they had more established immunity, and there was more treatment with quinine that was recognized at the time. That's why some of you may know that's why in the British colonial era they drank gin and tonics, because there was quinine in the tonic water. If you ever get malaria, drink lots of gin and tonics. So what you get with that, beginning with white settlement, with those fur traders who were retiring from the Hudson's Bay Company and settling down toward Champoeg, that area, that's when you get the first sort of white settlement in the valley, and then that increases, and you have the missionaries coming in the 1830s. You have white settlement beginning here in the valley. This is a rich area for farmland. Dirk mentioned that. This is incredible. All those prairies, and as Dirk mentioned, those prairies were maintained by the native people burning them off every year. Forestry people today, forestry biologists will tell you, if it weren't for the natives burning those prairies off every year, those grasslands off, what you would have had in the Willamette Valley is Doug fir and western hemlock forest. Because we don't burn off the prairies anymore, it's now estimated there's actually more forest cover in the Willamette Valley than there was at the time of first settlement. So once there's this incredible wave of settlement beginning in the 1840s, then in order to really anchor those land claims, that's when they began negotiating treaties with the native peoples to cede those lands to allow for white settlement. And Dirk mentioned the first treaty with Atfalati was in 1851. Let me see, I have another handout here. So this is a map that was made after that 1851 treaty. There was another treaty signed with several other tribes at the time, And this would have established a reservation for the Atfalati around Wapato Lake. So the map shows where that reservation would have been. That treaty was never forwarded to Congress because Anson Dart, who was the superintendent of Indian Affairs in Oregon, was told after he signed the treaty, you weren't authorized to negotiate any treaties. So it never went anywhere. There was another treaty then negotiated with the Atfalati, actually at Wapato Lake in 1854. That treaty was sent to Washington, and Congress and the president never acted on it. So a second failed treaty. And then finally there was a treaty in 1855 with all the bands and tribes in the Willamette Valley, the Kalapuyan Treaty, as it's called, in which virtually all the lands in the Willamette Valley were ceded and no reservations were established. The treaty simply says the president at some point in the future will define a reservation. So that's when the Grand Ronde and then the Siletz reservations were created then subsequently in the late 1850s by the president. I doubt that Buchanan, who was the president at the time, actually sat down with a map. He was simply handed a map saying, here, sign this. So we are on Kalapuyan lands. We are more specifically on Atfalati lands. One of the things to keep in mind is when we look at, anthropologists will sometimes draw lines on a map showing where the boundaries for these lands, where these band lands were. Those are sort of arbitrary boundaries. You know, keep in mind it's a convenient way of, you know, particularly for doing treaties, to draw lines on map. The lines on the map really don't mean much, or didn't mean much for the people who, for those Kalapuyan bands. Those boundaries were very permeable. People married across those boundaries. In fact, that was an advantage to have a spouse, a husband or partner who was from a different band. So this is, in some ways, that's why the 1855 treaty was done, because you really can't draw boundaries. You can't really say that Atfalati, generally you could say their boundary was off, is the valley floor. And what's known historically about where the villages were, again, most of them were clustered around Wapato Lake and the Gaston area, some up more toward Forest Grove. There was one somewhere in the Beaverton area, and interestingly, the Atfalati name for that village was Place of Beaver. So Beaverton is in some ways continued the Atfalati name. Robert Benson, who some of you may know, who was a really incredible Tualatin Valley historian, once suggested one of the northernmost Atfalati villages was called Chapanacton, and Benson thought that Chapanacton was the origin of Pumpkin Ridge, that the Tualatin name, the Atfalati name, Chapanacton, sort of got transformed into pumpkin. So that's sort of a general, filling in some of the gaps from Dirk. And then I'm going to talk just a little bit about the work I did related to the Methodist Meeting House. And I've said this to other people, and it goes back to, I worked on when the city was first wanting to designate this as an industrial, what's called the industrial site designation or certification, when all of this was still farmland. And one of the requirements for doing that is this going to affect any archaeological sites? So we knew about the Methodist Meeting House, and actually I was out here when I was still teaching at Rock Creek, when they cleared the woods here in 1985. Came out with Dick Matthews and Bob Keeler, who were then with the museum, and at the time watched those trees coming down. But one of the challenges, as some of you know, is there's no contemporary written record of the meeting house. There's nothing from that period of time. The General Land Office surveyors who came through and surveyed all the section lines and then surveyed all the land claims, did detailed maps of this area. They make no reference to the meeting house. It's not shown on any other maps, although the West Union Baptist Church is shown. So to me, it strikes me as very, very odd why there's no written reference from the 1850s to the meeting house. And the land office and the General Land Office surveyors were specifically told to include on their maps buildings. So they show houses, they show the Constable House, for example, they show roads and so on. The meeting house is missing. It strikes me, having worked with the GLO records for years, why there's no reference to the meeting house. All I can think of is none of those land surveyors were Methodists. So the archaeological work, so we did do some work in later, when Genentech was built, we did some work doing remote sensing, magnetometer and ground penetrating radar surveys to determine if there was any evidence of the meeting house. Now that strikes me, from what we know, that that's the wrong place for the meeting house. But Elizabeth Shute in the 1920s said reported that's where it was, but she was talking about a childhood memory. So this would have been 60 or 70 years later, and we know how good childhood memories are. And of course, all the landmarks that she would have remembered as a child would have been gone by then. But we went ahead and did that. No evidence. We actually found a horse burial over there, but no evidence of any human remains, no evidence of the meeting house. We subsequently did some work across here. We did start finding a little bit of historic period, what I would call debris, little glass fragments, and so on. But nothing we could clearly say was associated with the meeting house. Most of the material looked like it dated to the late 1800s, very early 1900s. So it's probably from the Shute house era, incidental, what archaeologists sometimes call yard debris, the stuff that you lose around yard, kids' marbles, fragments of toys, things like that. And then, as Dirk mentioned, there was subsequent work done with ground penetrating radar, more archaeological work done across the street for widening of the road here. Again, some additional artifacts, but again, the stuff much later than in time than what you would expect from the era of the meeting house. And part of the thing is all the references that we have, and this is the challenge for us as for a professional archaeologist, all the references we have about the meeting house are sort of second-hand or third-hand. So this is, again, I want to go back to the fact that General Land Office surveyors made no reference to it, which still leaves me totally mystified. It would have been, in the 1850s, a fairly prominent landmark out here. And they map in all the houses, but not the meeting house. So the other thing that we've been particularly attentive on now, and I'm working currently with the QTS data centers on the north side of Huffman there, is they've been doing the construction there where the Oak Woodlands used to be, because was another possible reported burial area. And looking for burials, particularly unmarked graves, archaeologists will not do any digging. The worst thing that could happen is dig and run into remains. So we will have to rely on remote sensing like ground penetrating radar. And then we did, starting 2 years ago, and now in the last couple months, surveys with a dog. dogs that are more commonly called cadaver dogs, but this is especially trained. They're called historic human remains dogs. And they are trained to, and there's been some fairly good rigorous testing with this of them. In some cases, they've been used to identify unmarked graves associated with California missions that go back 300 years. I did another project up the Sandy River where there was a reported pioneer burial, unmarked. The dog found it. The dog survey here has not been successful, has not turned up anything. I would not do ground penetrating radar anymore. I think it's, remote sensing is not the way to find GPR. I don't know if any of you are involved in doing GPR. It's a great way for finding underground storage tanks. We found the dog burial, or sorry, not the dog burial, the horse burial over here. We found discarded wrenches, things like that, a buried irrigation line. But in terms of burials, I don't think GPR is the way to do it. It's sort of a fallback that people use. I'm absolutely convinced now with the experience I've had, the dog is the way to do it. I think we all know dogs have scent that far surpasses anything we humans have. And we know that dogs have been trained. Michelle Sherman, who's the dog handler we've been working with, said when we first came out here with her, I said, well, there's probably going to be gophers and other, animals out here. And she said, no, the dog will only pick up human scent. That's it. And it's particularly focused on traces of adipose tissue, of fat, because that will linger in the ground for a long time. And she mentioned, for example, if there's a wooden post put next to a burial, that post will absorb some of that adipose tissue, that fat, and the dog will pick up on that. So the other challenge with trying to find unmarked graves, particularly those from the 1850s and possibly 1860s out here from the Meek children, is, and this is a problem all through the Willamette Valley, the soils we have here in the Willamette Valley are very acidic. Bone dissolves fairly quickly. Even long bones, heavy bones, skull, does not last in the ground for very long. Teeth are probably what would survive the most. I think, and Judy here knows better from the family records about the age of the children who were buried out here. And again, the era of the time, these would not have been placed in nice caskets or maybe even a coffin. A young child might have been buried, simply wrapped, a very young child was simply wrapped in a shroud. Whether there would have been any personal belongings placed with them that you might pick up archaeologically. This is where burials have been found. Both native burials and pioneer burials have generally been in areas that are in higher, drier ground, or the opposite, are in water-saturated soils, which allow for preservation. But this again, so very brief summary there on the effort to try to archaeologically identify the meeting house. And I have to say, Dirk I know is a little, most of you I think are a little more convinced than I am personally, that where the monument is exactly where the meeting house was. But I think it's as good as we're going to get here, based on the information we have. And I want to sort of wrap up on as an archaeologist saying the meeting house leaves me totally mystified. Why is there no record of it from the 1850s, even into the 1860s, when it would have been here, and it was a very prominent landmark. I think some of you know, not only was it a Methodist meeting house, it served for a while as the county courthouse. There were trials held there occasionally. The Methodists even let the Presbyterians meet there a few times. So I think achieving the monument there, as Dirk has indicated, was a major hurdle to get the city and the Majestic folks who built those warehouses to do that. But it's an incredible success, and you deserve all the credit for doing that. And Judy and everyone else who worked on that. So, thank you.
We didn't say we wouldn't do Q&A, and I think anytime you have a speaker come out, especially somebody that's got the background this gentleman does in doing the digging and doing the work and, you know, running into all this incredible history. I saw a hand go up. Tom, do you have we'll take a few questions and I'm gonna have Judy say a few words. And, but now's as good of time as any, and we'll give it a few minutes if you have some. Tom? Yeah. He's asking about the dogs. Yeah.
Yeah, I think when we first started working with the dog, I was rather skeptical myself. And then the more I've worked with Michelle, who's just an amazing woman, and her dog Cole, it's a great partnership for the two of them. And particularly the project up to Sandy, where I mentioned there was an unmarked pioneer grave and the dog found it. And, you know, it's a good example that our modern technology is far surpassed by dog technology.
You have another question? Here, Tom.
Yeah, I was just wondering where the meeting house might have been disassembled and taken away in bits and pieces to build other farmhouses and so forth. And so really nothing was left of it because, you know, there'd probably be the foundation would be what, rocks or really no foundation. Like I'm seeing here with this house, looks like a concrete foundation. I don't know, I was just wondering, but I'm sure you probably considered that.
Yeah, we didn't have a chance to talk about it too much. Well, we know that. It was taken down in 1865, and at that time it was taken to build the new Methodist church in downtown Hillsboro. There was so much work that went into trying to find this place, and that dog, when it came over here, there were 3 separate dogs. They did not get to work together. The dog has to stay in the car. There were 3 handlers. One dog comes out, runs the field, and then eventually they spin a circle 4 or 5 times and they sit their butt down and that's it. That's supposed to be something there. So in succession, 3 separate dogs were interested in 3 areas on that land, and 2 of them marked a spot that was within a few feet of itself. And then the city had David's team dig and look at those exact spots, and there just wasn't enough there. Okay, there was things found. The most curious thing that came out of all of this, because the Genentech site is this big building here, and then the site we were working on was here. Right between the 2 sites, unfortunately, our city asked Clean Water Services to put a sewer trunk in and put a 10-foot deep trunk right through the area, 25 feet wide, with no archaeology work. They exempted themselves. So there's things like that that happen, and then you wonder, is that what happened to the graves? Were they excavated by a public municipality that chose not to comply with the rules of the road? And there's some exposure there, and we've all talked about, do we do something? Do we go back and, what do you do, sue? I mean, we have Google Earth photos showing them working on the property line 10 feet deep with no designation. So, boy, this wind is a blessing and a curse. Does anybody else have a question for David? And then I'm going to have Judy say a few words.
Oh, I was just going to take these.
Okay, let's have Judy Goldman come up. Ms. Goldman, do you have anything you'd like to add on the Methodist Meeting House, the Meek family, or your thoughts?
I want to thank the Haig family for having us. I want to thank each and every one of you who have braved this hot, windy weather and turned out to come and see what we were talking about, and our previous speakers. And I must say, I have to thank Dirk for the several years of work that he has put into getting these folks to recognize that this was a historic place and that they should mark it. So I thank you. And the dedication will be this fall, and we'd like to see as many of you who are interested turn out and come see that. And my thoughts on, they're not on any map, but they were in my great-grandmother's explanation, and she said they were over here on the Constable place. So that is proof enough that those burials were here in this area, and if that marker isn't exactly on top of it, that is tough. So we are honored that this monument is being put up wherever non-exact place it is. So thank you all for coming.
Thanks, Judy. And Judy occasionally will talk about her great-grandfather, Joe Meek, and her great-grandmother, Virginia. And one of the great things that did come out of this is fascinating. We won't get into the whole Meek history, but Joe was with Kit Carson and Jim Bridger, and you see that movie, The Revenant, with DiCaprio, I forget that guy's name, Hank. He's a lesser known of a bunch of them that were up there in the Rockies for 13 years. If you ever want to read a fascinating book, and it may have a lot of her great-grandfather's tall tales, which he was known for, although many people say he actually lived it. You know, he was the guy that killed the grizzly bear with a buck knife. He certainly was an incredible physical specimen, as were any of the men or women who could live there. But I've read all the books about him, and the things you take away from the stories are about Marcus and Narcissa Whitman. Some of you have heard about the Whitman incident. They don't call it a massacre anymore. But they were friends with Joe and knew Virginia. And they came down here on horseback. You know, there was no Oregon Trail, right? So they come down on horseback, and there's women, all Native women, 3 Nez Perce women, sisters, right? All sisters. The daughters of a sub-chief of the Nez Perce tribe who let them marry these American men that had been in the mountains so many years without wives, without women, you know, coming for a new life. And some of the stories say they have babies in tow, it's winter, and they're crossing the Columbia River on horseback, as many as 11 times. And they finally get to Fort Vancouver, and Dr. McLaughlin, who is British, and he's in charge of making sure this area stays British, sees these 3 American mountain men, some of them pretty well known, and says, "What are you doing here with your women and your babies in 1840? There's nothing here for you." And they, of course, pled to come in Fort Vancouver. There's no coming in. And McLaughlin was known to help anyone he could. He wasn't supposed to help Americans, but he sent them to Oregon City with a sack of grain, and they wanted to be farmers. And the story goes something like, if you've ever been to Fort Vancouver, you're there on the plains above the Columbia River. He points to the west at the back of these mountains, which are known as the Tualatin Mountains, and said, "I've heard there's some open ground over there, you know, but you should go to Oregon City and meet whoever's there." There's 7 or 8 families living there at the falls. And this group goes to Oregon City, spends a couple of days, has their sack of grain, and decides to hoof it over the mountains, the hills west, and end up out here where they settle Christmas Eve, under a tent, dripping wet with babies. And there is, you know, the birth of our little valley here, short of a couple of others who are floating around in the region. But it's these Native women, even though they were Nez Perce, that the real story, and somebody will write the book someday, is that these women, using the knowledge they had, being Native women, really were crucial. If it hadn't been for them, I think it's pretty clear now, things could have been much different. And when we were working with the Nez Perce tribe, and they did come, and we did a wonderful ceremony here. It's on YouTube, you can watch parts of it. And they blessed that land. We couldn't film the ceremony, but what he said, their medicine man, Charles Axtell, who's a professor at University of Idaho, we did about 45 minutes of singing in a round, and he spoke in the native tongue. And at the end, he would stop and say, I've told them about what's to happen to them. I've told them there's going to be machines, there's going to be noise, there's going to be things happening to you, and you've never crossed over, and I don't want you to wake up and be angry. That would be bad. So the ceremony we had was to bring them forward and advise them what was going to happen next. And he said, I have to do this. If I don't do this, what could happen to the people involved with all this is not good. So he blessed the land, and he asked the children to not be angry. When he came here, he was speaking to these children that were Virginia and Joe's children, Nez Perce children, in their native tongue. It was a beautiful ceremony, and their former chief was here. We're with Ray and Carol, and it was quite a quintessential moment to see one of the owners of this property, who's been in the lineage in his older years, Ray Hagg, who was a founder of our outdoor school programs here in Washington County in the state of Oregon, and a great educator. And Carol, his wife, was a great gardener and mother. To see them with these older gentlemen from the Nez Perce tribe, and all of us celebrating and trying to talk about what would happen next. It may be a factory now, but that's going to be the largest historical monument in Washington County, and we hope to do many more. They're hard to do, but we want people to turn their head and say, why are those 5 columns there? So you'll see when you go over there, and there's a panel up here about the Methodist Meeting House design, but these basaltic columns, one represents each of the children that are buried. And then on the spiral wall, there'll be informational panels, starting with the Atfaladi people, working its way through to what happened here, and the Meek and the pioneer influence. And then at the end of that process, the tribe that was here, and working with Ginny Mapes, who's really great historian here in Washington County, who's not able to get out much anymore, we found out that Joe Gale, Gales Creek Joe Gale, was married to Eliza. And she was, it turns out, she was Chief Joseph the Younger's sister, half-sister. And the Nez Perce tribe had lost her to time. And so their trip here was so beneficial because they went back and were able to make the connection that Joe Gale had, who was also a mountain man and a scout and all that. He had ended up with Chief Joseph that we think of when we, the famous Chief Joseph. He's the younger. His father was Chief Joseph too. That's his half-sister, and she was also super involved here in Washington County with her family. So we owe a great debt to the Atfaladi people for handing us off, whether they had any choice in it or not, this unbelievable valley, this unbelievable place. The Missoula floods helped, and that's just chance, right? But we do have such a beautiful place, and we really, I mean, in closing, I'd just like to say, well, there's something else I have to do before I ask you guys to become members and go out and see the house and stuff. Judy, can you come up here? This is Don Gunther. Is it Ginther, Don? How do you say Ginther? Gunther? Don Gunther is one of our members. And Don, come on up. Tell us about the bowl here in my hand. And this has a meek twist to it. This is a meek. Go ahead, Don.
Well, before I give this to Judy, I just want you to know my wife was just crying that we were giving this bowl away. So my ancestors were actually Meek neighbors right over here. And when they came across in 1840, we gave them some dinner, Judy. So my opinion, if my ancestors weren't here, Judy wouldn't be here because we helped save them that first winter. But When I first came, I didn't know anything, and Judy would drive me around, and she's so wonderful, and I would insist on, I would sneak up and pay her lunch, you know, sneaky. And she was just so wonderful to me, and I know she's been wonderful to all of you. This really is an award about Judy and how beautiful she is. But when one day when we were driving around, they cut a maple tree down off of the old Meek place. And Judy, you know, oh, that's a Meek maple. So I ran out and I grabbed a piece, threw it in the back of my SUV, and we had this bull turned by a professional. And it looks like a salad bowl, sort of, but this is a gallery grade museum piece of all things. The beauty of this bowl, you'll have to take a look at it. It's so beautiful, but it was so appropriate to give to Judy an appreciation for all she's done to us. Because Judy is such a beautiful person, this bowl is like Judy. So, thank you, Judy.
That's really great. Yeah, this comes from the Joe Meek claim itself, which is, well, the Meeks and the Constables were neighbors, but these claims are a mile by a mile, right? They're big. So the Meek place is about a mile that way, and the old home site's there, and these maples surround the farmhouse that's there now, which is more of a 1920s, 1930s farmhouse. But the Meek maples are massive, but they're starting to break and fall apart. They're also protected cultural resource, so when you hear people talking about a cultural resource, that means it's a protected property. And so for Judy to have a piece of that maple, we don't think Joe planted them. Probably his son, Courtney Walker, might have planted those.
Quite possible. We don't have anything in writing,
Nothing in writing.
but we have things in pictures.
Well, I would, yeah. Thank you so much, Dawn. That's really special. You had that done. And Judy, she's been my guide. She's been a lot of people's guides. If you ever have the chance to spend a few minutes with her, come to one of our functions. Or ever have a question about a grave, a building, a person, it takes about 20 minutes, and I can get you everything you need if you don't reach her personally. So thank you, Judy. Big hand for Judy. Okay, in closing, if you become a member, it would mean the world to us. We don't expect you to have to come to things, but we may need your signature on a document if we're in the middle of a scrap on something, or if we need your appearance or voice. We do need board members, so we're in the process of asking. It's pretty easy to be on our board. It's fun to be on a board. You get to kind of weigh in on how you think things should go, and we all would love to have a house and a museum and all that stuff, so we have lots of plans, okay? Liza, come on up. Yes, please, Wendy. I'll make sure to send it to everybody that came today. I'll email you guys some links. You guys can go watch some of this stuff. I've recorded quite a few. We have lots of history stuff online. But yeah, that would be the gathering we had at the Hague Farm. Liza Shade, who's...
I'll be really fast.
No, I want you to know this person here, when it comes to history, this person's an incredible resource. Just got her degrees recently, and she's moving into the fast lane of being one of the best working historians. And tell them what you're doing right now, Liza.
Hi, everyone. I really will be quick, I promise. I know we've all been listening to these wonderful things about Washington County history. So I will just say really quickly, I'm a working professional historian. I was the collections manager and curator of Five Oaks Museum, which used to be Washington County Museum. I did that for 8 years and worked with their collection, and I got to learn so much amazing things through the objects. So the objects themselves are important, but it's learning about the people that use those objects that really amazes me. And so I did that for 8 years, went back to PSU and got my master's in history, public history in the Pacific Northwest. And then I am now at Clark County on the other side of the river learning about Vancouver history. So I want to say, though, that during my master's degree, I wrote my master's thesis about historic homes. And I did 2 internships. I did one down in Bend for Shute Historical Society in a historic house they had on a property that they worked with the Bend Park and Rec Department. They were partners. And I went down there and gave an assessment of the house and did an inventory and talked to them about ways that they can do 2 things. And this is what I think is important when it comes to houses like this and historic properties. So I talked about two main points in my thesis. The first of all is that houses like this land on a really wide spectrum. So we've got everything from like the century home like this, all the way up to like the Pittock Mansion, right? So there's this wide spectrum of houses, and what we need to do is not just focus on the elite properties, but focus on properties like this, the farming families, the people that really lived here and had everyday context and every day lived their lives and worked this land and bled in the dirt, and that goes all the way back to thousands of years of Native American indigenous nations that have lived here, right? So we have to, when we're talking about historic homes, there's two things. We want to think about interpretation, right? So that's not just telling the history of that one family, okay? Yes, that's of course very important, but we also want to broaden our thoughts about the Native Americans that lived on this land for thousands of years, all the way up to, all the way up to what we're doing today. And that is restoring, opening these places up, and then doing monuments, etc. like that. So that's the first part, reinterpreting and working with the collections in those houses and making them, you know, nice and presentable aesthetically. And also, when I talk about interpretation, it's talking about making panels. You know, when you bring the public through a historic house museum, you want to tell the history of that area, right? So the second thing about my thesis that I wrote about is public access. So in order to get more people to see these places, you have to interpret the properties and get them in a place where the public can access them, right? So that's what we're doing with the Historical Society and the Haig family is we want to show this house to the public. We want to educate people on the history of this area. And it's not just history in one time period in one place. We're talking about continuous history. Excuse me. From Native, yeah, okay, I'll go for it. From Native American history all the way up thousands of years, all the way up to today. And what we're doing today and tomorrow, that's all part of history. So that's all I wanted to say is that it's so important that all of you are out here and supporting not only us, but supporting the Haig family in their efforts to save this property and make it publicly accessible for tours, et cetera, et cetera. They still have to live here and use the property, obviously, right? But we also want to make sure that the public gets engaged and educated about these places. So that's why it's important. That's all I wanted to say, and thank you so much for coming again today. And if you have any questions for me, if you want to talk about collections, I will talk about artifacts all day long. So anytime you want to talk, I'm around. So thank you.
Okay, that's it, guys. Thanks for coming, and we'll have a couple more things going on by the end of the year. So I'm pretty sure we have all your emails. Thanks for coming, and we're going to go inside. Oh, the guys just brought out we have ice cream bars and ice cream sandwiches, guys. So go grab whatever you want over there and cool off. If you haven't seen the gardens or walked the trails, you're free to do that. Thanks for coming.
Now sugar